My name is Caroline DeLinks, and this presentation is on climate change and how we as humans are impacted. So basically, the human race utilizes much of the Earth's resources, whether it's water or gas and metal for vehicles. With the human population increasing as drastically as it is, which is about 200,000 people per day, we are reaching our limit on what we can utilize from the earth without impacting it directly, and that will then directly impact us. So our increasing usage of energy and resources is taking a toll, which causes climate change and global warming as we heat the atmosphere via the increased release of greenhouse gases, which is from the burning of fossil fuels. And if we continue on this path, climate change and global warming will only continue to worsen, and it will have detrimental impacts on individuals, nations, and the entire global economy. So, beginning with how climate change will affect people specifically, health detriments are one of the biggest known issues. With the extreme weather events becoming more frequent, severe health risks from food, water, heat waves, storms, flood, the dispersion of the food system, increase in zoonosis, which is diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans, and vector-borne diseases, which are diseases that can be transmitted from blood-feeding arthropods, like mosquitoes, ticks, as well as mental health issues. The people that are most susceptible to these factors are those who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged, like minority groups, poor communities, older populations, people with underlying health conditions, children, and other people. These factors become more an issue in terms of health because with climate change, more exposure pathways are opened up. So these exposure pathways include air quality, water quality and quantity, food security and safety, and as I stated before, vector-borne diseases, heat stress, and extreme weather events. So, keeping all of that in mind, the people at risk end up with the following occurring to themselves or their loved ones. That's injury or mortality from the extreme weather events, heat-related illnesses, respiratory illnesses, waterborne diseases and health impacts, the vector-borne diseases or zoonosis, malnutrition, foodborne diseases, non-communicable diseases, which are called NCDs, and mental and psychosocial health issues. Another way that climate change can affect people specifically is labor loss and lost wages. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that of all the jobs in the U.S., 45% require medium strength for manual labor. That's a large percentage of people that we need in order for many jobs to be completed so that all citizens can have access to resources that these workers earn a living to acquire. The increase in climate change poses a threat to these workers and their income, as the increase in temperature causes health risks, as mentioned before, which results in more frequent breaks from work as the dangers become too high. So the Environmental Protection Agency projected that by the year 2100, over 1.8 billion labor hours will be lost, which would result in about $170 billion in lost wages. And that would result in financial crises for those employed with manual labor jobs and their families. The third effect that I'll be talking about is choices regarding the future in terms of reproductivity. So it's a kind of interesting one, I guess, a bit debatable, more opinionated, but people have been living in a state of anxiety, especially younger folk, as they're reaching the age where they have to question whether they want to have a family or not. And a study was conducted by Matthew Schneider-Meyerson and Leon Kit-Ling, which is titled Climatic Change. And it reports polls from a survey of 607 U.S. Americans ages 27 to 45, and 96.5% of the respondents were all very concerned or extremely concerned for the well-being of their existing, hypothetical, or expected children. The study also showed that younger respondents were more concerned than older respondents. And almost all of the respondents had considered climate change to be deeply concerning for the children of the future because there's an overwhelmingly negative expectation for the future as we watch our world slowly become less of what it once was. So now many people from younger generations are forced with an ethical and philosophical decision to make about their innate human right to bear a child, which is something that previous generations have never had to really consider in such a way in terms of climate change. So the next 3 impacts I'll be talking about have to do with national economies. So the first example I'm giving is increased crop loss from drying and flooded land, which will increase the cost of crop insurance and crops in general. So Stanford University did a study regarding the increase of cost of federally subsidized insurance program, which protects farmers from drops in crop rate prices and yields. Findings showed that the long-term warming contributed to 19% of the $140 billion total that went to losses covered by the U.S. crop insurance program from 1991 to 2017. And it's estimated about $9 million go into crop insurance per year. So the point of crop insurance is to support the farmers whose crops are struggling, but it's extremely expensive, and the cost of this insurance could increase between 3.5% and 22% by 2080. So according to the these are all according to the statistics of the Environmental Working Group. But farmers are bound to be impacted financially, whether they decide to pay for the increasing cost of crop insurance or they don't, and they have no financial protection from the loss of their crops. So this lower than expected production, which results from poor conditions from climate change, will be felt nationally, as there will be a lack of produce to feed the country, and that'll definitely raise the costs of the products that are available. And because of all that, only those who are financially affluent will actually be able to afford the crops that do make it, which leaves those who are not financially affluent in quite a tough situation. I will also be talking about property and poverty. So the World Bank published an article which provides evidence that because of the effects of climate change, 100 million people could be pushed below the line of poverty by 2030. That's 7 years away. The extreme weather is resulting in $520 billion in annual consumption losses. And by 2050, climate change could drive 216 million people to move out of their own countries. All of these things combined play a role in the scenario below. So say a neighborhood floods and the value of the properties decrease because of the flood. The property taxes will thus decrease since the amount of taxes owed is dependent on the value of the properties, and the value will be going down since the flooding. As the taxes go down, there's less funding being offered to schools, roads, fire department, hospitals, etc., because it is property taxes that are used to fund those things. And as those fundings are being offered to those specific things like schools and roads, more people begin to move because the town isn't what it used to be. This leaves those who can't afford to move stuck in areas that don't have enough money to fund the essential programs necessary, and it creates a feedback loop where people are just suffering. Oops. Oh gosh, lost. Okay, sorry, there's an L right there, don't accident. Coastal flooding. That is the third thing that I will be talking about that will affect national economies. So the Foreign Policy published an article which focuses on the coastal loss of Rio de Janeiro due to climate change. And the article claims that 10% of the world's population live by low-lying coastal areas, which are now being eroded of their natural barriers, having resources destroyed, as well as having their water quality being degraded from the flooding caused by the climate change. So the statistics predict over the next few decades, 570 low-lying coastal cities will face 1.6 feet of sea level rise. That will result in around $1 trillion in economic loss. About 800 million people's lives will be at risk if that occurs. And Rio de Janeiro is one of the most vulnerable cities, with their overpopulated, unruly cities often controlled by militias and drug trafficking factions. People are basically sprawled around everywhere in these areas, even drained marshes, and those areas are really at high risk for flooding and experiencing a landslide just different landslides from increased precipitation. So many lives can be lost there specifically. How climate change will now affect the global economy. So starting with inflation, economic growth will be influenced by global warming via damage to property and infrastructure, lost productivity, mass migration, and security threats. Once such events become recognized as permanent, especially in certain areas, people will find that capital stock won't be worth replacing. So over time, the capital stock can end up negatively impacting shareholders due to share dilution, which means existing shares become less valuable. The more capital stock there is, the more an economy's productive capacity increases by allowing more goods and services to be produced. But with the damage to properties and infrastructure, capital stock could be permanently lost, impacting output. And this ultimately means that a country can incur a higher debt to GDP, which is the gross domestic product. And that can challenge their economic stability and limit what they can invest in. Because basically they're spending more than they are acquiring. Global fish stocks. The impact of the sudden rises in global temperatures is also being felt by marine creatures, since in the past 30 years, marine heat waves have been estimated to increase by more than 50%. That's terrible for marine ecosystems and limits what fish are capable of surviving. It also reduces the potential seafood that can be caught for human consumption. So with less safe seafood available to be caught, the more the available seafood is overfished. Slowly, jobs will be limited as well. And for those who rely on the fishing industry for their income, life will become increasingly more difficult, kind of similar to farmers. The NOAA reports that 1.7 million jobs in the U.S. alone are supported by the marine and fishing sector. If many people lose their jobs because of the lack of available fishing, it may lead to the collapse of the fishing industry globally, which in the U.S. contributed to $117 billion gross domestic product in just 2020. So you compare that to the entire world, and that's a really severe issue at hand. Finally, policy responses. So basically, mitigating and dealing with climate change requires a collective effort from governments, companies, and citizens around the world. Policies that are put into place usually directly target carbon dioxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas that we produce as a race very rapidly. In order to reduce the excess amount of this greenhouse gas being produced, we need to put policies in place, and everybody needs to agree. It's important when considering policies how the companies that benefit from carbon dioxide production will pay for the social costs of producing said greenhouse gas. So in order to deal with that, there's a proposed method called carbon pricing, which basically means putting a cost on each ton of carbon emitted. This could work and would work with decreasing carbon dioxide emissions. However, many companies will refuse to do so, as agreeing to carbon pricing could make their economies internationally uncompetitive, which means they will not be vigorous enough to compete with other foreign companies. And basically, the potential loss of profit for many companies is enough to deter an agreement globally to limit carbon emissions. So, yeah, it's really good out here. And these are my citations. Thank you for watching. Apologies for all the stuttering. This was a long presentation.